Hi, welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. My name is Austin Chadwick and co-host is Chris Lucian. And today we are going to address a topic that came up in community discussions on one of our previous episodes. I think a conversation started in the YouTube comments. And a good friend of the show, Jay Bazuzzi, asked us to do an episode on what's the difference between mobbing when you're doing something like R&D or experimentation versus something where you know exactly what to do. Maybe that mobbing that looks more like a traditional kata you would see, like a FizzBuzz kata or something like that. And after kind of queuing up the context a little bit, Chris, yeah, what's your thoughts, suggestions, stories in relation to this community question?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny because I think I've experienced the an evolution, even when I was first mobbing, because when we first started out, uh, even before we were mobbing on production code, we were doing katas,
Hmm.
and there was a focus on kind of making sure that the person that knew the least about what we were doing was navigating more often or an equal amount of time. So strong
Right.
style, pairing style randoris or something.
Yeah.
And eventually it went slowly from a few people having more context to things being more and more equal. That then became that very first request to mob that I've talked about on the show before, where there was a tax deadline looming and everybody needed to get together, and that became very much a series of experiments and R&D and it was problem solving together. Hey, pass the keyboard, we'll try this, that sort of thing. It became very fluid and dynamic, even though we started out as very much the Randori style. And then that gradually went back to a the style of we kind of know what we're doing as everybody was learning the frameworks and as we kind of got into a flow and until we hit something that would then largely be different again, and then things became uh, very different, or I guess moving up and down between levels of navigation, right? So it's like, hey, let's all
Mhm.
learn more about the strategy pattern, and then others learning about the strategy pattern allows for the mob's collective ability to navigate or listen to navigation, and it shifts. And so I think to me, it's something that's like very dynamic and fluctuates based on what's going on. But how are you, Austin?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's in my mind, if you're doing mobbing beyond the classroom, um, and doing mobbing in the real world, uh, I think knowing this distinction is, at least for me personally, quite critical for sanity.
Yeah.
Because I think your goals shift dramatically. So when you're in kata mode, um, where you know exactly what to do. Let's say we're adding a button in a framework we know, and the button's talking to something over the network in a framework we generally know. I mean, it's not like there's no unknowns, but it's just like, this button's going to do some math and then it's going to send some data over, the network to somewhere else, right? Something like that. Um, in that style, it literally can be just as fast commits as FizzBuzz, right? Like, you know, red test, little tiny red test, little tiny green test, little tiny clean, and you just on that on repeat. It's on those days that I feel like boasting, like I want to like tag Dave Farley and say like, continuous delivery is real. Come see it here, and like point to our like 70 commits that day or something, insane. Um, where you literally can be releasing, multiple features in that day and just feeling uber productive. Um, but there are times where you don't know that much, where you can be literally that efficient with your small steps as far as releasing to production, because you would probably be releasing junk because you just don't even know what it takes to make it to work, right? Like you're dealing with a third party API you've never dealt with before, and the documentation's horrible, and you're gonna have to guess at what the arguments are, and or you're dealing with not speaking at all from recent experience at all. This is completely hypothetical, but you're dealing with ancient code and you're doing what Uncle Bob, I believe it was in the Clean Code book called, oh, what's the name of that practice? It's like what you do when you're like going into a cave with ropes. I think it's like spelunking
Oh,
or something like
spelunking, yeah.
spelunking, right? Yeah. So you're like winding your way through this ancient code, trying to find where is the place to introduce some polymorphism to add a new feature, right? Um, and so, it's there's the unknowns list is very gigantic.
Mm.
And so if you go into that kind of work and you're expecting 40 commits, you're going to be very disappointed. You're going to think the mob was a complete failure. You know what I mean?
Mm.
And I've actually heard people say that in the community. I joined a mob and they were just kind of like, writing some code and throwing it away. And it just felt like, nothing really happened. You know what I mean? And it's like, um, and so I don't know, any advice for, mental sanity?
Oh yeah.
Uh,
Well, so yeah, I think about this sort of thing a lot because
mhm.
there's definitely a the adrenaline rush of the or the endorphin hit whenever you commit and push and see the pipeline go through and stuff. And so you sort of need that in research mode, and so I do the whole Eric Ries innovation accounting lean startup stuff where you're basically it's the number of things that you can prove wrong and how quickly you can prove them wrong. Because I think if there's this idea, and I've also recently read the book Black Box Thinking, and in Black Box Thinking, they talk a lot about this idea of like experiment falsifiability. And so, and it's when you can kind of prove that something, proving something is true actually isn't as useful as proving something is false, right? And so in a scenario where you're working through different ideas or things along those lines, I think that it's really important that you have a list of falsifiable experiments because you can just knock those out. And that is also a good way to provide that endorphin hit. It's like, oh, that one's wrong, or that one's false, that one's false, that one's false, that one's false. You get this flow of proving, things are false until you hit the like, oh, that one worked. Okay, let's expand on that. And it can kind of be like a tree, but you're exploring that tree. And so I think when you're doing zombies style testing, you have a picture of a tree that you're going to touch each of the nodes. And then in this special case, does this have like some later special case? Okay, then you're going to do a whole new set of tests. And so because zombies beget zombies, right? You'll find more if you find one. And so I think the inverse of that when you're in the research mode is saying, this is these are all the things where I wish they were true. And if they were true, then we could do what we wanted to do in the first place. And so if you had a long list, and especially like if you're doing the spelunking thing and you're going through, ancient code, it's like I would love to assume that this code is decoupled, right? And
Yes.
so, and I would also love to assume, if it's not decoupled, I would love to assume that
Mhm.
there is a seam that exists. And
Mhm.
I would love to assume that the database call is not buried between, 10,000 layers of stuff. And then you can go and look and it's like, is it decoupled? Oh, no, it's not. All right, cross it off. Hey, that's like a commit. That's a really good finding. And I think the biggest mistake people make in this mode is that they don't track the things that should be falsifiable. And then the word, I've seen it really fall apart where then the team is arguing about something they've already proven correct or
Mhm.
incorrect, right? And
Right.
because no one
Right.
was doing any tracking. So
Right.
if you go back to the mob programming RPG, the archivist role where somebody's writing on a whiteboard all the things going on, like it's extremely important in this mode because you're saying, you know, you're not going to get any commits because but you are going to get like strike throughs of this is
Mhm.
false, this is false,
Yep.
this is false.
Yep.
And as you go, uh, as you narrow down the problem space, then it becomes more and more fun and you get closer and closer going back to that commit mode.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. What you shared is exactly what has helped me. Is that I think if you kind of free will R&D,
Mm,
um, it can feel, I mean, exciting if you're a chaos type person.
yeah. Just
Uh,
guessing. Yeah.
yeah, just like embracing the madness. Um, but I think because at least for me, when you're stretching, you're doing R&D and trying to, like you said, prove things right or wrong. How many things can we prove wrong today that don't work? We can't
Yeah.
do this way. Um, it's very mentally taxing. You know what I mean?
Mm,
And so, um, because, like something very peaceful is a kind of mobbing on something I know, right? Because then it's easier to step back and do like coach stuff, like how are people interacting, or oh,
yeah.
what code smells do could we work on, or you know. But when the problem at hand is very taxing, like you said, the archivist becomes key. And so my mom recently went through this, and so whether you're using real sticky notes, virtual sticky notes, a discovery tree of some kind, or a combination of those. It's even useful to have that. Like sometimes we'll write stuff on our desk, but also have it shared on the team. Um, and literally saying as a team, have we proved that this experiment failed? Yes or no? And then moving that to done, right?
Right.
Um, and then that the warm fuzzies can come from that.
Mm,
um, and as opposed to the red green. And I think that can be very, very satisfying. So, for example, in some tips when you're working in this area, it would be to, just like are with TDD, I think a lot of the same spirit and principles and idea apply. You want to go as small as possible, right?
right.
So, if um, let's say this in this place of the code, we think we can inject a seam. Um, is there an experiment we can run that'll prove it false or wrong that we can find out in 5 minutes? Versus someone starts navigating one that it's going to be like, this is going to take 3 days until we know if this experiment fails because
Right.
you're just reaching into the guts of, I don't know, NuGet or NPM and like, okay, let's change one of 100 and then we'll keep going down the list. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there's times and places where there's no other way to find out other than doing that. Um, but keeping the experiments very small, not only for accelerated learning, but accelerated engagement, right?
Right.
Because a long feedback loop between experiment idea and experiment result, um, not satisfying. Also, too, you begin to forget what are we even checking? Like it's
Right.
just the solution's been read for 3 days now, and I don't even know what we're doing anymore. So so that's something that comes to mind. Also, the criticality of feature flagging and doing TDD where you can. So,
Right.
building that safety because there are ways where you can do, not always, but there are ways where you can do these R&D and experiments where you put all your learning behind a feature flag and you can
Mm,
actually push it and to be like, we committed this, we proved that it didn't work, and then the next commit reverts it back. You know what I mean? And you can just
right.
kind of see the stream of learning, or you can do a branch, I guess. But the whole idea is if your experiments are behind a feature flag, and let's say you TDD the feature flag, or you TDD what you do know, because sometimes when you're in R&D mode, you're tempted to embrace a really long feedback loop because you think there's no other way. But we were just mobbing earlier today where we're like, okay, we need to know if the code runs like this chunk of code. We don't know if this chunk of code works, but we also don't know if this chunk of code works in this architecture on the CPU in this old code, you know, uh, running in its natural environment, right?
Right.
And so the tempting thing to do is to take both those experiments and put them together, right? But if you can TDD with an integration test or something, the chunk of code until you know it works. It's not like, oh, we missed a slash or we called the name wrong or we're doing something dumb with the API. That works. Now the experiment is only does it work in the natural environment, right? So you just try to chunk everything down into smaller steps. And at this point, you're not necessarily TDDing because you know you're going to keep it and you're going to make this clean and glorious and the tests are backing you.
Right.
It's just so you don't go insane because there's like 20 things unknown. Let's just chop them off one by one, little by little.
Right.
You know?
And I like, so there is the coding by intention aspects
Yeah.
of TDD. And in that scenario too, you can code by intention the API you wish existed, and then you could mock the solution as if it existed, and then you
Right.
have the base to then
Yeah.
capitalize on the research once it's complete, and that can provide some focus because it's like, hey, we need the thing that replaces the mock in the real code, and so that can be super useful in that scenario. But eventually, you do have to kind of eliminate all of those all of the possibilities in the possibility tree, and some of it is really maybe you would unit test your way there, or maybe it is just a in an isolated environment, does this code do anything?
Yeah.
um and kind of running through experiments that way. And I think the nice thing about some of these large language models lately is you can say like, oh, here's the scenario, go do that, and make it a very simple scenario, and just see if your thought process is even leading in the right direction.
Mhm.
Um, and then before doubling down, and so all in the favor of a fast feedback loop.
Yep.
Um, and so, but I do think that there is something that's very good out of the falsifiable,
Yeah.
statement. It's
Big
like,
time. Yeah.
yeah, you
Yeah. And
don't
I
want to
think,
be wondering the whole time.
yeah. And I think you're right. And I think it is super. Well, two things come to mind. One, um, long feedback loops again, and then the sunk cost fallacy. But going back to feedback loops real quick, I think if you're in R&D mode with a mob and they're waiting more than 10 minutes or 15 minutes for something to run to find out if it worked or not, ask the question, can we make a smaller experiment? Because it's
Right.
like you don't want to wait 15 minutes to find out you missed a semicolon or something dumb,
Right.
right? And so um, there may not be a yes answer, but at least try to seek to find how can we tighten that feedback loop as much as possible for as much as possible, you know. And then going back to what you were saying, um, what was the other point you were saying? You were saying, oh, sunk cost fallacy. It feels kind of like we found out what didn't work, like a failure almost, right? But it is actually glorious in an R&D shop to know this doesn't work. Like this idea, this solution is dead. Do not put any more money in this. Like, you know
Right.
what I mean? Like, um, and sometimes maybe you don't appreciate it until you have something that is working. But there's been times where we didn't know how to do a thing. We tried four different ways. Um, and once you found the way that worked and how fast it was and how much better it was, you're so glad you didn't go down the other way. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
and so, um, yeah, and I think maybe that's maybe a meta question to the quote unquote leader in this conversation. If you're reporting back to the business on your spike, on your
Mm.
research, um, how do you talk to them about it where they understand that proving five ways it doesn't work, it was good, and that they shouldn't go get their work done by someone else.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of people without context, whether it's leaders or stakeholders,
Hmm.
anyone, I think that the people without context are worried that the problem space is infinite
Ah,
because and that they'll never hear back from you one way or not another on whether or not you'll actually do the thing. And I think this is why a lot of large refactoring initiatives get sabotaged by a leadership role, is because uh, it feels like it will be forever. It feels like it won't have an end. And so, even though they're arbitrary numbers, a lot of the times just quantifying the areas that have already been visited uh, can, in a refactoring, for example, can provide a lot of confidence in those stakeholders. And so, I think that the problem space of an R&D topic is also that way, where it's very nebulous to say, hey, we're going to refactor this thing. Or Better yet, we're going to discover a new algorithm that has a lower computational complexity and an improved, you know, uh, uh, runtime, right? And the, you know, some people may want to invest in that and some people won't. And you need to have, I think, goals around it. And so if you tell somebody that you're going to do that, they're going to ask like, what is fast enough? How long, uh, they'll ask something like, how long is this going to take? But in reality, they're just saying, we won't be paying for this forever, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
So I think having a brainstorming session about what the problem space is and the areas about, um, what those falsifiable things are, and then reporting that out and just say so when reporting out to a stakeholder, it's a lot better to say we've identified 350 possibilities and we've eliminated 120 of them, right?
Yeah.
Because then everybody, even though you may take longer on some and less on others, you can see that you're approaching some, potentially asymptote.
Hmm.
But I guess in the end, the idea is that it's like, oh, it's not going to take forever. And if you then time box in the format of spikes, um, then you could say, no one item on this list is going to take any longer than so much time because we will
Sure.
abandon that path. It is not a valuable further investment, or we might
Hmm.
discover something earlier. Breadth first searching versus depth first searching.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so all of these things, I think, are strategies and how to talk to stakeholders when dealing with those things.
Yeah, yeah. I'll add on a few other things there, and I think we're good to close. But yeah, I think quantification is huge, and then also visualization. Sometimes, kind of
Right.
like, here's the charted territory of known, and then here's the uncharted territory, right? And like, kind of coloring that in, right, is quite helpful. Um, and then maybe just saying what you said, different words, taking on an experiment mindset with their finances. So you believe this R&D is important because it'll make money or achieve customer goals or something. um, how much are you willing to spend?
Right.
Do you want to spend a week's worth, 2 weeks worth? Do you want to check in every day and kill it if it's not making enough progress after a day? And then I think just being very honest with your learnings, right? Like sometimes, uh, me and my wife are watching rewatching the sitcom Better Off Ted, and it's like
Mm,
an R&D shop in the non software sense. But sometimes they'll start a problem and it seems simple, but then you find the scientists find themselves trying to solve like, growing hair problem, which no one has ever done before. You know what I mean? And
right.
so I've been in efforts that sounded fairly reasonable, and then we reported back after a couple days about, whoa, we thought there were 5 unknowns, but there's really 60, and this is what we have to do to solve it. And they just like, all right, kill it. Let's move on to something known,
Yeah.
and moving on. Or they're like, nope, this is worthwhile. Let's keep investigating. And so just being transparent and knowing that they're, like you said, you don't want an infinite problem space, right? So it's always kind of like we can keep researching or stop researching, and that can be part of the discussion, right? Like when do you stop and when do you keep going?
Right. That's
And
very different when you're talking
uh,
about computation versus
mhm.
like, the laws of physics, right? And so
Yeah,
everybody, room temperature superconductivity would change our world fundamentally, right? And
yeah,
there was the paper that was supposedly solving that everybody tried to reproduce, and there was a big surge of news around room temperature superconductivity, and then it kind of went away. But that is many organizations, and a lot of them more government funded, because there is like this idea of like product innovation where there's a lot of knowns that you're reconfiguring, and then like fundamental beliefs innovation, and in which case the problem space is actually infinite, but
yes,
and
yes,
we as a society, as a culture, invest in those in a different way, through like either government funding and or like academic research, and that's a whole other space. But I think that software is interesting enough because it really can be range anywhere from just a few items to infinite when you're trying to discover a solution to a problem. And so it's all a relative amount of known versus unknown, across that.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Yep, yep, yep. Fantastic. All right. Well, please like and subscribe. Please share this episode with others. I kind of feel it feels like we're talking about science in the future and the limits of nature and, you know, the final frontiers of software. And, you might find yourself near an infinite problem space and all that and how to handle it. But anyways, yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Where have you been? Are you in a shop that's just basically churning out known computer science, or are you in a shop that's more near the edges, or have you been in kind of more the pure research space, and how have you handled that potentially as a mob or from an XP perspective? We'd love to hear your thoughts, opinions, and everything on LinkedIn, X, YouTube, and more. And until next time, mob on and have a good one, everybody. See ya.